Welcome to NarrativeNook audio tales where enchanted stories come to life. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe, like and share to support our channel. Enjoy listening.
Spencer missed what Nicole said earlier. Someone like Eric, who's so boastful, can get to meet Mr. Wyance. Why can't Nicole? Spencer thought. Although Samuel and Stanley did not speak up, they probably had the same thought. They were not going to be bothered by Eric's fake threat. Even if they were unaware of his background, they were not afraid of him. Compared to him, my sister's so amazing. She knows tons of people. It's not surprising that she got to meet with Mr. Wyance. If Damien and Dillian knew that their nephews thought that way, they would be furious. Eric was mad. He was pampered and lived a rich life. His fat hand was slapped so hard by Samuel that it was swollen. Eric winced as he said, "Nicole, you're so ungrateful, you're in big trouble." A hint of ruthlessness flashed upon Eric's eyes as he looked at the redness on the back of his hand. He then looked at Nicole and her brothers, who were looking furious too. A chilly voice came from behind suddenly. "Who's in big trouble, you said?" Samuel looked back. He was surprised and shouted, "Sean." Sean showed up unexpectedly. Not only that, but Steve came also. There was a cold glint flashed past his eyes under his gold frame glasses as he looked at Eric. When Sean and Steve saw Eric chased after Nicole, they knew he would trouble her. They were worried that he would take advantage of Nicole. So, they followed Eric to check it out. They heard Eric speak harshly to Nicole just when they reached. Sean squinted as he looked at the fat man, Eric, who was sweating. "My sister rejected you, Mr. Anderson." Steve smiled coldly as he looked at Eric. "You don't have the right to force Nicole to do something that she doesn't want to do. Do you understand?" he added. Eric looked at the two men in front of him. "Those two brats just now were rude to me. But the two men right now are even worse," he thought. Sean and Steve were way younger than Eric. However, he could not help but feel intimidated as he looked at them. He walked a few steps back sheepishly. He then clenched his teeth frustratedly and said, "You shouldn't see it that way." Maybe Nicole was confused at that moment. That was why she didn't accept my request. Maybe when she's finally clear-headed, she will follow me to meet with Mr. Wyance. No one from the Riddle family has the chance to meet with Mr. Wyance now. But I can make it happen for them, he thought. Just when Eric was thinking about that, Stanley drove his car here. Nicole still did not raise her eyes. She asked Samuel and Spencer to get into the car with her. Samuel glared at Eric as he got into the car. Spencer looked at Eric coldly as he said goodbye to him before he got into the car. Eric shouted as he saw Nicole was getting into the car too, "Nicole, you rejected me now. Don't regret it in the future." Nicole heard Eric and looked back with an impassive face. Her eyes were filled with disdain as she sneered at Eric, "Let's wait and see." Nicole then said goodbye to Sean and Steve. Stanley started his car. The black Maybach sped away, leaving the gloomy Eric and the two cold-looking Sean and Steve behind. Sean looked at Eric and left without saying a single word. Steve saw that Eric looked dissatisfied and furious. He shook his head and left with Sean. "The Riddle family doesn't welcome you, Mr. Anderson. Please leave." Eric clenched his fist. He came here with pride. But he was standing here with disgrace. He did not get what he wanted. "This isn't the way I do things. It's all because of Nicole. She's so stubborn that the carrot and stick approach doesn't even work." Eric was furious with what the Riddle family said. He stood in front of their house. He looked at the door coldly as it closed. He clenched his teeth as he said, "All right, way to go you guys. The Riddle family doesn't welcome me. I don't even want to be here." Eric was mad as he got back into his car. "I'm going to tell Mr. Wyance about how rude the Riddle family was to me when I meet him the day after tomorrow. It's too much. They're going to beg me to say good things for them as they cry." Eric felt much better after he thought about all these. He then drove toward Club Studio. He was going to let off steam after what happened to him today. The next day. It was a sunny day. Nicole arrived at the examination venue in the company of her brothers. The place was overcrowded. The number of teachers and guardians was more than the number of examinees. Nicole asked her brothers to leave when she saw that the place was so happening. She did not want to be the center of attention again. Gary and Rain arrived too. Although Rain was in the 12th grade, she was in Class A. Her team was led by Mike. Rain ignored her team and stuck with Gary. She was going to ask him about something, but Gary did not bother her. He turned around and walked away while looking annoyed. Rain chased after Gary and complained, "It's so hot here. Gary, let's go back to the place just now, okay?" The reason why Gary walked toward the sunniest area was to get away from Rain. But Rain did not realize this. Gary turned around and looked at her coldly. "Go back there on your own. Stop following me," Gary said aversively. Rain was stunned as she looked at Gary. She was furious. Gary did not realize that she was angry with him. Students from Class A are all over there. Here are the teams from Class B. What are you doing here? Mr. Ellison ordered every class to send representatives who were not participating in the Mathematical Olympiad to support the participants. Gary walked toward Class B, which was led by Ms. Emerson. Rain and Noah were led by Mr. Kennedy. Rain was too busy following Gary and was unaware of her surroundings. When she raised her eyes, everyone from Class B gave her a strange look. Jack and Wayne were standing next to Gary. They both were holding their arms as they looked at Nicole calmly. Tolerance for her can no longer be seen through their eyes. A sudden hint of nervousness flashed upon Rain's eyes. Rain remembered how Jack and Wayne asked her harshly to have Nicole pack her stuff the other day. She was still afraid of the scowl on their faces from that day. However, Gary was still right there. Rain clenched her teeth and wanted to continue walking behind him. However, Vivian, who was standing beside Rain, saw what she wanted to do. She quickly walked toward Gary, one step ahead of Rain. She then looked at Rain as she said sternly, "You're entering the hall soon. You should go back to your class and get ready. Stop following the student from our class." Rain looked at Vivian unconvincingly and wanted to say something. At the same time, Gary saw Nicole walking leisurely behind him. His brows frowned slightly. He quickly walked toward her and asked, "Why did you come so late?" Nicole looked at Gary, who was standing in front of her looking serious. "Exams today." "I'm going to ignore his interrogative tone," she coldly said. "There's no point reaching early." Gary was furious with Nicole for giving him the cold shoulder. "You have boasted in front of others. Don't score 0 in the exam again." Nicole ignored what Gary said and walked past him. Her face was expressionless. Gary was pissed when Nicole left him behind. The reason Jack and Wayne came was to support Gary. When they saw him look furious, they walked toward him. "What's wrong, Gary? Are you not well prepared?" they asked. Jack noticed that Gary was still furious. He poked Wayne as he said, "Gary, don't be angry because of Nicole. Her grade is bad, and the exam is starting soon. She probably isn't in a good mood right now. Whether or not she can even get a single digit in the exam is questionable." Gary glanced at Jack as he heard what he said. He then walked toward his team. He was angry at Nicole not because of her grade but her attitude. Nicole shamelessly said she was well prepared for the exam when she didn't even put in any effort. And she came late even though her grade was terrible. On the other hand, "I reached here an hour earlier. I thought I could help her to bone up the exam if I met her. Not only she isn't good at math, but her attitude toward learning is also terrible. She definitely can't get first place in the exam." Gary was surrounded by all the students when Nicole was talking to Ms. Emerson. It was like Gary was their only hope. "Gary, all the best for your exam. We're counting on you." "Yeah, Nicole's grade is so terrible. We know that you're under a lot of stress. But we believe that you will win an award effortlessly." Gary's face remained expressionless as he thought, "I can't just win any award." Nicole's bet was to get first place in the exam. The thought of Nicole scoring 0 in the past mathematical Olympiad exam and the bet between Nicole and Mr. Kennedy frustrated Gary. He stared at Nicole coldly as he walked toward the exam hall. Most of the students around Nicole looked at her with total contempt. Nicole's grades so terrible, and she still dared to reach here so late. Rain felt not too happy when Mr. Kennedy called her back to his side. After all, Mr. Kennedy had assigned her to lead the focus classes, which were Class A of the 11th and 12th grades. Noah was the class monitor of Class A of the 11th grade, while Rain was the top student of the 12th grade, so he was akin to having two trump cards in his hand and was confident of winning. After Ms. Emerson enjoined precautions on Nicole, she finally let Nicole into the exam hall with confidence. Vivian looked at Nicole with cold eyes and mockery on her face. Mr. Kennedy came out of nowhere and let out a sarcastic smirk when he saw Nicole walk inside. "Nicole, I'm curious how many points you can score, winning a first place or simply scoring 0. Hearing his voice, Nicole tilted her head and looked at Mr. Kennedy with a glint flashing in her eyes. "Don't forget what you promised." Mr. Kennedy's bet with Nicole was that if he lost, he was going to apologize to Ms. Emerson and admit that he was not as good as her in public. Mr. Kennedy choked, not expecting Nicole to remember that, but a look of disdain quickly flashed across his face when he remembered that Nicole's grades were poor and that Rain had said Nicole had never done revisions. "Don't bluff. If you can get the first place, you will apologize to her however you want." Nicole looked at his ugly face and thought hard for a few seconds. "Deal." Seeing Mr. Kennedy was infuriated because of her, Nicole turned and entered the examination hall with a straight face. Mr. Kennedy was furious and had nowhere to vent his anger. When he looked back, he saw Ms. Emerson was looking nervously at Nicole's back. He narrowed his eyes and walked over to Ms. Emerson with a sneer. "Your student, Nicole, is so full of herself. I'm looking forward to seeing her results." Ms. Emerson glanced at Mr. Kennedy but said nothing. Meanwhile, Lulu and Bradley next to her looked at Mr. Kennedy from behind and quietly uttered a "bah." Noah also followed her into the exam hall. Seeing Nicole come in poised, he secretly asked Rain, "Didn't you say she was your sister? Do you know how good she is? Was her 0 score last time just a joke?" Rain watched as Gary kept a close eye on Nicole. She clutched the pen in her hand and raised her head proudly when she heard Noah's question. "She is as good as just that 0 score. I just didn't expect that she would have the courage to walk into this examination hall." Her voice was full of contempt. Noah felt a sense of relief at hearing what she said. He ignored Nicole and concentrated on memorizing the formulas he had just learned. His hands and feet felt numb as he thought of the upcoming exam. Gary never eased up his furrowed brows as he looked at Nicole's languid manner from behind. He pressed his lips together tightly at the thought of the impending exam. At last, a teacher whom he had never met before hurried into the exam hall with a stack of test paper, scanned his eyes around and instructed everyone to put away the things in their hands as the exam was about to start. Seeing the students do what he said, he nodded, clearly pleased by their response, then distributed the test paper. The exam time was 2.5 hours, and students may submit their papers half an hour in advance. Nicole casually scanned through the questions. Because she rarely wrote by hand, she was not used to it and was a little slow at first. After familiarizing herself with it, she slowly picked up the speed and wrote like a pro. 2 hours later, Nicole calmly got up and put the test paper on the desk of the teacher in the front row. Rain, who was sitting behind, looked at Nicole and bit her lip bitterly. The questions, many of which she had never seen before, were difficult beyond her imagination. She had only finished less than half of them and was not sure how many she could answer correctly. Seeing Nicole submit her test paper so quickly, she was filled with hatred, thinking that Nicole left so quickly because she could answer none of the questions. Rain felt better at the thought of this. But she wasted too much time staring at and cursing Nicole. By the time she shifted her attention back to the test paper, there were only 15 minutes left. Rain checked her watch, and her face turned pale. But the more nervous she was, the more she could not answer the questions. She skimmed through the rest of the questions and found that she could answer none of them. She suddenly sweated profusely, clutching the pen in her hand, and blamed it all on Nicole. "It's all Nicole's fault." Gary also looked up at Nicole, who was very focused when answering the questions. He did not know if Nicole had answered all of them or just submitted a blank test paper, but he was sure that it should be the latter. How could Nicole possibly have answered the difficult math Olympiad questions that even I find extremely difficult? She must be sitting there too bored and wanting to get out. 5 minutes later, Gary got up and handed in his papers, his face unchanged, and no one could tell if he answered well or badly. Noah, on the other hand, looked at those around him, handing in papers one by one, and was sweating profusely. His hand holding the pen was wet with sweat. Looking at his test paper, sweat seemed to trickle down endlessly, as if he could not wipe it off entirely. Finally, the bell rang. Everyone was eagerly waiting for their classmate to emerge from the exam hall. Those from the Royal Creek Institute thought that it would be Gary or Rain who would come out first. They were at the rear and could not see what was happening in front, so when they heard people whisper that the first girl who came out was beautiful, they subconsciously thought it was Rain. The Class A students started to clap their hands and congratulate each other excitedly. The earlier one came out, the quicker one had submitted the paper, and the more confident one was. But it was also possible that one did not want to waste time sitting in the exam hall because they could answer any of the questions. They thought Rain definitely belonged to the former. The Class B students looked at the Class A students with envy if only Rain was from their class. As pretty as Nicole was, she sucked academically. Many of them clenched their fists, thinking of how Nicole looked down upon them yesterday. But soon, the excited cries of Class A stopped. The Class B students were puzzled and looked up ahead. What they saw surprised them. The first girl who came out from the exam hall had a face as bright as the moon and snowy. She was none other than Nicole. Nicole did not care what the Class B students were thinking, but sauntered up to Ms. Emerson. "How is it?" Ms. Emerson asked softly. "It's all right. Not too difficult," Nicole said with a nod. Students from other schools walked past with their heads down behind her. They all looked up at Nicole upon hearing what she said. That's so arrogant of her. The Class B students thought they knew Nicole and did not take her seriously. They thought Nicole must have even failed to understand the exam questions and was bored sitting in the exam hall, and that was why she was the first person who came out. How could she be compared to Rain? Vivian sneered upon hearing what Nicole said. "Stop embarrassing yourself here. Everyone knows you scored 0 on the math Olympiad paper before. What's the point of pretending here? By the time the exam results are out, we'll know if you're genuine or fake." Ms. Emerson gently frowned at the cynical Vivian. As she turned to look at Nicole, she saw Nicole give her an "it is okay" look, so she pulled back her gaze. She wondered what was wrong with the class monitor lately. It seemed that she deliberately targeted Nicole. Nicole did not care. Meanwhile, Lulu handed her a glass of water, and Nicole took a sip, smiled faintly at Lulu and said, "Thank you." Lulu shook her head and winked at Nicole, then imitated Vivian's disdainful expression and made a grimace. Both Bradley and Nicole were amused. Vivian saw what Lulu was doing and stood up abruptly. "What the hell are you doing, Lulu?" Lulu quickly did away with her expression and looked back at Vivian with a blank look on her face. "What's wrong with me?" Vivian was so angry that she could not find a word to respond. She pointed at Lulu, wanting to scold her when out of the corner of her eyes, she saw Gary come toward them from afar. She quickly lowered her hand and glared at Lulu and Nicole. "I'll deal with you all later." Jack and Wayne also saw Gary and rushed up to meet him. Looking at Gary's expression, they carefully asked, "How was the exam?" Gary looked calm. He glanced at Nicole, who was talking with Lulu not far away, and said, "It's all right. But this year's exam is difficult. I can't guarantee that I will get first place." He had come prepared, but the test questions were too difficult. Even though he had done his best, he was still not too confident in himself. There was a major question at the end of the test, in which he felt something was wrong with his calculation steps, as if he did not come to the right answer. He also did not know how others were doing. Wayne saw this and comforted him. "You don't have to worry, Gary." When Nicole thought it was simple, and you even more so. Gary frowned. "Did you say Nicole thinks the questions are simple?" Nicole didn't say it was simple, she just thought it wasn't difficult. Jack chimed in to explain. Gary frowned even more upon hearing what Jack said. "I swear that this is the hardest of all the competitions I have taken part in at home and abroad." Yet Nicole thought it wasn't difficult? Is she ignorant, or did she really think that this competition is simple? He quickly dismissed the latter and looked coldly at Nicole from behind with disappointment in his eyes. Things have come to such a pass, yet Nicole can still keep up appearances. I'm curious how she will soft pedal the thing when the results are out. She really dares to say anything for the sake of her ego. Many of those behind Gary, hearing his evaluation of the exam, looked at Nicole with a strong sense of disdain in their eyes. It's game over for Nicole, yet she still wants to pretend. How many questions could she answer when even Gary found them difficult? She probably couldn't answer even 1 inch. Vivian came close to Gary, feeling triumphant, and asked him about the competition when she heard people badmouth Nicole. Gary looked coldly at the girl and just responded perfunctorily before leaving. Nicole talked to Lulu and others for a while and then told Ms. Emerson that she was leaving. Since all the candidates from her class had come out of the exam hall, Ms. Emerson agreed with a smile and told everyone to disperse and go back to rest. Seeing that Nicole and Gary from Class B had come back while his 2 candidates were still nowhere to be seen, Mr. Kennedy's face turned grave. He clenched his fists and looked at the crowd in front of him, waiting with some anxiety. It was not until almost all the candidates had left that Rain and Noah came out. Both of them looked pale. Mr. Kennedy did not need to ask them to know that they must have done terribly, but he still hoped for the best. "How's the test?" he asked. Rain glanced at Mr. Kennedy. She had tried her best, but there were still many questions that she could not solve. But thinking that almost everyone had the same problem as her, Rain gritted her teeth and said, "Not too good. But I noticed that no one could answer all the questions. Even Gary couldn't finish the last question." Noah looked down spiritlessly at the back. He had not observed as carefully as Rain did, but he could sense that everyone was not doing well. Mr. Kennedy looked at the 2 students whom he held in high regard with disappointment in his eyes. But he said nothing when he heard what Rain said. He suddenly frowned when the thought of what he saw just now came to mind. Nicole was the first to come out of the exam hall. "Do you know how she is doing?" Rain exchanged a look with Noah, with her eyes glinting. She submitted the paper half an hour in advance. "I guess she couldn't even read the questions clearly." Mr. Kennedy's face looked much better upon hearing what Rain said. Since most Class B students had left, he motioned everyone to disperse. He then thought for a moment and walked over to a male student from Class B, who was still there, and asked, "How is Nicole doing in the exam?" The boy was the one who laughed at Mrs. Wallace Sr.'s attire earlier. He was startled when he heard a voice asking him a question from behind. He looked back. When he saw it was Mr. Kennedy, he responded with respect. "Are you talking about Nicole?" As Mr. Kennedy nodded, the boy smirked and said in a disdainful voice, "What Nicole said was wishful make-believe. Gary has said that the questions are difficult, and he has no confidence, yet Nicole said it was simple. Do you believe her?" He found Nicole's words amusing, not expecting Nicole to be so loudmouthed. The thought of Nicole saying that she could score first convinced Mr. Kennedy even more that Nicole was bluffing. Can anyone believe the words of a person full of lies? Mr. Kennedy felt a sense of relief. He looked at the boy and nodded proudly at him before he left. The boy looked puzzled, wondering why Mr. Kennedy asked about Nicole. But he quickly figured that presumably, Mr. Kennedy was afraid that Nicole would win. He was also a student of Class B, looking forward to Ms. Emerson beating Mr. Kennedy. But Nicole had gone overboard with her brag, and no one would believe that she could get a good result, so it seemed that they could only count on Gary. While Nicole was sitting for the exam, Preston was eager to go take a look. But he was tied up with work at the office, and so he could only go to Edwin. He swiped the access card to go to the top floor, where Edwin and Rowan were right in front of the server. Looking at the restored interface, the mixed-race doctor looked pleased. "Not half bad at all. This is much earlier than you have told me." What they had told him before were 5 days. He did not expect that they could stop the intrusion in 3. Not only that, they had even launched a counterattack. Edwin looked calm and did not dare to say that he was stupid, not even seeing the hidden attack methods of the attacker. Had they only been able to stop the attack 5 days later, probably nothing would be left in the database by now. Warbler secretly gritted her teeth as she also heard what Rowan said. She could not stop thinking about what that girl said that day, which sounded so ambiguous. But she kept a straight face, just like on normal days. "Is that girl really Lucifer?" Rowan looked at the data transmission progress on the screen. There had been a minor miscalculation during the process, but the other side had shown its professional problem-solving ability, perfectly resolving the bugs that almost caused the transaction to abort. A faint hint of suspicion appeared on the handsome face of the mixed-race doctor as he thought of the other guy looking helpless against the hacker the other day, but now things had been solved entirely. He said politely to Edwin, "I have already transferred the money to your account. Check your account in a moment. Please excuse me if you find this intrusive. Could you tell me who has such a badass ability to help you solve this problem?" Edwin hesitated and said nothing. Preston had come over and had just heard Rowan's question. Nicole's advice that day came to mind, and he said, "No comment." Rowan frowned as he looked at Preston. Rowan had a bad temper, but since this was not his laboratory and Preston did not want to tell, he was not going to force him but just nodded his head with a stony face. Edwin was well aware of how generous Rowan was. He gave Preston a look, telling him not to offend this big client and that he should be more polite even if he did not want to tell. Thinking of this, Edwin smiled at Rowan and said in a gentle voice, "That guy is not from our company, but someone kind to help us. We don't know her true identity." At this point, Preston raised an eyebrow and looked at Edwin, then echoed what he said. "Yeah, we don't know her." Edwin could tell the ridicule in his voice, but his expression remained unchanged. He looked at Rowan with a sincere face as if what he said was true. Rowan looked at him suspiciously. He was quite proficient in Hustruabergian, and so he could tell the unnatural tone of Preston's voice, but he did not give it a second thought. He nodded, grudgingly believing what Edwin said. Then he took out his phone and whispered something into it, then left without looking back. Preston gave Edwin a look, asking why he was not sending his big client back. Edwin shrugged at him and pointed his finger upwards. Not that he did not want to send the client back, but the client had a helicopter picking him up, and he was not needed. Preston looked at Rowan with surprise. Rowan also looked at him with a strange look in his eyes. As he finished talking on the phone, he looked up and down at Preston, and asked curiously, "You're a foreigner too?" He did not look like one, but judging by how quiet he was and the strangeness of his tone of voice, he seemed like when he first came to Hustruaberg. Edwin glanced at Preston, and his expression froze for a moment. He then smiled and said, "He's not a foreigner, he just likes to be funny." Rowan squinted at Preston twice before turning and walking toward the rooftop. "He doesn't talk much and just lets others explain for him. Isn't he a foreigner? Could he be a Macronian spy? Why does he look familiar to me?" He muttered to himself as he went. When Owen met Rowan, he was wearing a black coat, and his handsome face looked as if he was deep in thought. Seeing Owen come over, Rowan looked at him scrutinizingly and then asked coldly, "Why do all Hustruabergians look alike?" Owen thought for 2 seconds and then looked at Rowan with a sincere face and said, "To be honest, all Eperonians also look alike to us." Rowan looked at him for 2 seconds to make sure he was not lying to him and then slowly boarded the helicopter. Hearing the noisy chopping noise above his head finally fade into the distance, Edwin took out his phone and quickly checked his account, looking at the balance and smiled with relief. He then transferred half of the money to Zeke. He remarked the transfer was a one-off mission reward. Preston felt bored and looked out at the scenery outside, quietly observed everyone's expressions through the glass, then said to Edwin, "Let's get something to eat." Edwin followed him out without looking up. Warbler watched the back of the two of them walking into the elevator and then lowered her eyes, expressionless. She walked over to the server, reached out her fingers tentatively, and quietly typed a few letters. As if she had triggered some kind of violent reaction, the screen started to turn strangely blue and run rife with activities as lines of code were constantly replicated. On the other end, because the code had vanished, White looked surprised and then ecstatic at the data that was being transmitted to his terminal. He quickly restored his computer with the help of the other party. But halfway through the recovery process, the person at the other end seemed to have encountered some problem and was forced to stop. Warbler looked at the sick but vital code that was out of her control and suddenly scrambled to unplug all the power cables of the server as if the letters on the screen electrified him. "What is going on?" She looked at her hands with a hint of internal struggle in her eyes. "Do I really want to expose all this to the enemy?" Just then, the voices of Preston and Edwin were heard from behind her as they had finished their meals and were now returning to work on the top floor as usual. Seeing Warbler rooted to the stop with a nervous look that she had not managed to hide on her face, Preston raised an eyebrow and asked, "What are you doing here?" Warbler looked at them, not panicking as she quickly adjusted her expression. She drew the loose hair to the back of her ear and appeared embarrassed. "I just want to see how the firewall that the guy has set up before is working," she said with her head lowered and a glint of jealousy in her eyes. Nicole's firewall was so advanced that she was struggling to understand it, let alone get started with daily maintenance. Did she mean to trip me up? Warbler asked in her mind. Preston watched her expression with interest and then exchanged a glance with Edwin with a smile. Don't work too hard, he said, stepping forward and looking at Warbler's fairly pretty face with a shallow look of concern. You must have not gotten enough rest lately. Go home and get some rest. Wrinkles and dark circles are starting to pop up on our faces now. Preston patted her on the shoulder meaningfully and then sighed and said, I'm really touched to see my staff work so hard. Edwin coughed softly as he looked at Warbler's angry face. Go home and take a rest, Warbler. The crisis has been diffused. You don't have to watch here day and night. Warbler did not really want to leave, but she thought about what Preston had just said and subconsciously wanted to find a mirror to look at her face. She was only 24 and did not want to look older than her age. With this thought in mind, she could not care less about what she had not done. She nodded at Edwin and walked out, quickly leaving the top floor. Preston looked at her from behind, and the smile in his eyes faded, replaced by a faint sense of detachment. Edwin stepped forward, saw the disconnected power cables on the server, and sighed softly. I didn't expect Warbler to become the person I was most worried about. She used to be dependable. Preston looked back at the rebooted Jagu and then stepped forward and typed lightly on the keyboard. Soon, he saw signs that some kind of protective mechanism had been activated. He smirked and restored the intercepted signal in a way as if he had done this for the 100th time. Who knows? The sun was shining brightly outside. Snow was at home doing revision, but she had been feeling not well lately and had lost 10 pounds of weight. She had been on a slimming program all this while, forcing herself to go hungry. Now, after losing 10 pounds, she looked like a skeleton. It looked as if she would snap at the blow of the wind. Maybe someone would say that her body was perfect. Snow held a pen in her hand, her eyes looking at the questions, but her mind was elsewhere. Ever since she lost the diamond, she could not sleep, especially after Harvey said that she could only talk to him again when she got the diamond back. Now, she had only one thing in her mind, which was to get the diamond back from Nicole. That brat got a large diamond from some man, yet she still stole mine. Snow clutched the pen angrily, kneading her fingers constantly as if she had fallen into a state of anxiety. She could barely feel at ease only when the thought of what she had said to Karen and the assurances Karen had given her came to mind. As tight-lipped as Nicole was, she had 10,000 ways to make her talk. While she was thinking about this, the mobile phone in her bag suddenly rang. She took it out with irritation, impatiently wanting to hang up. But when she saw the caller ID, she almost jumped for joy. I can't believe that Harvey calls me. She answered the phone in disbelief, her eyes starting to well up at hearing the gentle voice that she had not heard for a long time.
Thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed this story, please like and share so others can see it too. Also hit the subscription button and notification bell so you can be notified on our next release. Thank you for your support. God bless you.